All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our next Malagasy Speaker Series lecture. We're so excited that you are all able to join us today. I'll go ahead and let Marie Roland over in Madagascar introduce our newest speaker.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marie Roland Swazafi. I'm from Cursa. And today we are happy to welcome our speaker, Sarobidy Rakotonarivo. She's a Malagasy scientist in an environmental socio-economist with an interdisciplinary background in natural resource management. She mostly uses surveys, experimental approaches, and mixed methods to understand decision-making in the areas of rural livelihoods, environmental justice, and conservation. She recently completed a 3-year postdoc research on conservation, food security, conflicts at the University of Stirling, and she is now a research fellow at the University of Antananarivo. And she is actually investigating the social aspects of forest carbon projects such as RED+ and forest landscape restoration projects. We really appreciate your background and your efforts, Sarobidy. And also we would like to thank the Duke Limmer Center for hosting this presentation and the Duke Africa initiative for supporting this talk. So we are happy to welcome you again, Sarobidy.
Mary.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mary. So I'm sharing my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, yeah, so hi everyone, and thanks so much for being with us today. So I'm Sarobidy Rakotonarivo, and I'm currently a research fellow at ESAFORE, the École supérieure des sciences agronomiques. And today I'm going to talk about who benefits and who pays for forest conservation and restoration, and how. So the logos you see here at the bottom, these are the universities where I've worked for the past few years. So this is ESAFORE at University of Antananarivo, and these are the logos of programs as well as projects within which this, the research I'm going to talk about today took place. So as most of you know, conserving forests brings so many benefits to our lives. If you only talk about the role of forests in climate change regulation, as well as through carbon storage, as well as the role in, like hosting animals and plant species. So in Madagascar in particular, forests are home to almost like 90% of species of plants and animals are found nowhere else on Earth, apart from in Madagascar. And forests also offer multiple benefits to local communities, such as fuel wood, medicinal plants, and hydrological benefits. But the restrictions on forest use and access imposed by forest conservation can also bring costs for local people. So where you've got people who are really dependent on clearing forests for agriculture, then inevitably, if that forest is conserved, then there is a cost to these people. And in particular, my research over the past few years suggests that people value land so much that they may be willing to risk jail to clear forest land for cultivation. And this shows how important land clearance is, that they will take such risks. The good news is that these local costs of conservation are well recognized internationally. And conservation projects should commit to compensating those who are affected by the negative impacts of the projects. But as we will see later on in my talk, that this has often fallen short of expectations, and compensation measures are often delayed, incomplete, or non-existent altogether. So these local social costs of conservation are not unique to Madagascar. Clearing forests for agriculture provides access to fertile soils to millions of small farmers in the tropics. Forest conservation to agriculture for staple crops such as rice or maize or cassava, or also for cash crops such as sugarcane, cocoa, or vanilla. They are therefore the biggest drivers of forest loss in the tropics, especially in Africa, with the fastest growing population in the world. So as tropical economies develop, trade-offs that demand hard choices between conservation and development goals will be the norm. Many of these trade-offs are poorly understood, and they cannot be easily solved. A key part of the problem is that the interests of farmers and wider communities are often misaligned. So while land management decisions take place at the farm scale, many of the impacts of these local decisions are felt across the landscape at the national or global scales. And likewise, forest conservation has global benefits. We just talked about that. But it often comes with restrictions on forest use and access, and this can lead to local costs. So my research for the past 10 years has focused on understanding trade-offs and synergies in environmental management. So I've been developing an integrated mixed method approach to resolving trade-offs or conflicts between different visions of landscape management. And by mixed method approach, I mean like combining quantitative methods with qualitative tools, such as like using field experiments, such as experimental games, or randomized controlled trials with qualitative interviews. I've been really privileged to work in a very multidisciplinary teams, including engineers, modelers, ecologists, as well as conservation practitioners. And these are some of the case studies I've worked on. So the first one is on conflicts between forest conservation and forest conversion to agriculture in various African countries. But today, for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to focus on Madagascar. In Scotland, I looked at conflicts that are caused by overabundant geese that are feeding on farmers' valuable crops, such as barleys. And in Gabon, I studied human-elephant conflicts. So while these cases might appear different contextually, beneath the material manifestations of these conflicts, such as the destruction of people's crops or farmers' inability to clear forest land, there are deeper and more social, more complex social conflicts between multiple stakeholders with conflicting values and agendas. So these trade-offs between conservation and development exist in many countries in the tropics, but today, for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to zoom in Madagascar. And first, I'd like to talk about this study looking at the social, local social costs of conservation in Madagascar. So this work is one of the many outputs of the P4GES project funded by the ESPA program in collaboration with several colleagues, both in Madagascar as well as in the UK. So many of this work has not been published, and here I've put the links to the papers, which can all be accessed freely. I'd be also happy to share my slides to anyone who's interested. So before exploring this research question, who bears the cost of forest conservation, let me first give you some context. So this article by Viedon et al., so this was quite almost like 3 years old now, looks at 6 decades of deforestation and forest fragmentation in Madagascar from 1953 to 2014. And they estimated that Madagascar has lost a total of 44% of its natural forests cover over that time period. In 2003, to halt forest loss in Madagascar, our then president, Mark Ravalomanana, has decided to triple Madagascar's protected area system from approximately 3% of the territory to approximately 10%. And this is also known as the Durban Vision, and this has led to the mobilization of substantial additional international support. Most of you might have heard about the right plus concept and some key points in the debate between those supporting right plus and some that are against it. So the ultimate aim of this project, of this right plus concept, is to reduce greenhouse gas emission due to deforestation and forest degradation, and increase carbon stocks via forest restoration. Many countries around the world, including Madagascar, as you can see on the map, have received financing for REDD+ pilot projects, often built on top of protected areas and expected to provide the much needed financial support for the new protected areas, and also to compensate for any local costs of forest conservation. So those that are in favor of REDD project argue that it is a cost-effective means to counter deforestation and forest degradation in order to mitigate climate change. At the same time, it provides many social and environmental benefits. However, REDD opponents protest strongly and contend that this concept doesn't respect the rights of local population, most of whom live in extreme poverty and depend highly on forest resources. So these are the specific research questions we wanted to address in this study. So first of all, we wanted to know the magnitude of local opportunity costs of preventing Sweden agriculture on forest land. So this is also known locally as teviala. We wanted to know how these costs are distributed across local households, that is, whether the poorest and less educated people are more likely to bear more costs. And how do the compensation measures that were delivered compare with the estimated opportunity cost, and who gets it? So we conducted this study in the eastern rainforest of Madagascar in a set called CAS, Corridor of Ankani and Zamena, where it is estimated that 65,000 people live. So we sampled 4 sites in total, so 2 sites where the government has experimented with REDD+. And in one of these REDD+ sites, people who have been affected negatively by REDD+ have been given compensations. And 2 sites with long established protected area or national park. So these are Matadi and Zahamena National Park. So to estimate the opportunity cost of conservation, we used carefully designed trust experiment surveys, which are well-established methods in impact evaluation, especially ex-ante impact evaluation. And these methods, trust experiments, are especially useful when we lack reliable counterfactuals or comparators. That is, when we don't have any data on what would have happened if conservation had not taken place. So these methods might also be very helpful to predict how respondents adapt to a policy change and devise compensation measures that would integrate the needs of the affected population. So we complemented these quantitative estimates from the trust experiments with qualitative interviews with a subsample of respondents to explore in more depth respondents' thought processes while answering this experiment, and also the rationale for their decisions. And we also conducted in-depth agricultural surveys where we collected data at the parcel, plot, crop level to better link production and inputs. So you might be wondering why we worked with such a relatively small sample size. So yes, the sample size was judged quite small by many reviewers who are mostly agricultural economics that often sample like thousands of households when they do these kinds of study. But we wanted to prioritize quality without compromising the reliability of our findings. And as you can see in these pictures, field conditions were really harsh, and we wanted to reach isolated communities. Sometimes you had to work for an entire day to reach some of them. So what did we find? So on the x-axis, you will see the net opportunity cost estimates of conservation, and on the y-axis, we show how these costs might vary across different groups of communities. So when these costs are negative, what you see here on the left-hand side, that means that people are incurring costs overall, whereas when they are positive, that is on the right-hand side, people are the net opportunity cost, they are positive. So people derive benefits from conservation overall. So interestingly, we found that the site level effect on the net opportunity cost estimate was greater. That is, it was more negative for the site that did not receive compensation, this one, than the site which received compensation. So by compensation, I mean safeguard projects which are meant to offset the negative impacts of conservation. So opportunity cost estimates from sites that are in long established protected areas are also significantly higher than the newly established protected areas with REDD plus safeguards or compensations. And this might reflect the effect of experience, that is, people in the long established protected areas are better able to estimate the cost of conservation as they have experienced the challenge of switching into livelihoods not based on Sweden agriculture. So the median value of the net opportunity cost was estimated at $233 per household and per year. $233 might seem quite small to my American colleagues, as this is just probably the cost of a new phone. But these costs are very significant to the average Malagasy household because they represent 27 to 84% of the total annual income for median income households. And this proportion is even greater for the poorest households compared to those who are less poor. And this finding was consistent across the range of discount rates that we used in this study. So social safeguards in REDD Plus project are seen as one of the key ways to deal with potential negative impacts of the projects on people. Sorry, this tends to lag behind. Yeah, so for example, the World Bank requires social safeguards to be in place in all the projects that it funds. One of the key questions is, of course, whether the social safeguards on the REDD Plus really help offset the potential negative impact to the local people and reach the right people. I'll now present some of our findings on this issue. So this work has also been published and is open access if you want to read the full text. So this graph shows that the factors that might increase, that might affect the likelihood of a household being identified as a project affected person, or PAP in short. That is, people that are eligible to receive compensations under REDD Plus. So we found that most of the factors that we expected would make a person more likely to be a PAP had little or no significant impact on the likelihood of being identified as a PAP, except their membership in COBA or community-based local associations, and how food secure the household was. So our study highlights that households that are likely to be politically, socially, and economically more powerful due to their membership in COBA or due to their long established status in the village and their higher food security are more likely to be identified as PAP than those who do not possess these characteristics. So in contrast, instead of being identified as PAP, project affected people, households with lower food security appear to have less of a chance to be identified, and generally, households who have lived for a long time in the location have their own land and they are less likely to clear new forest and probably suffer less as a result of forest use restriction. On the contrary, the poorest households who more likely face the cost of forest use restrictions are left out from compensations. And overall, our study, our results suggest that there was some elite capture in the identification of people affected by the project. I think it's really important to touch on some of the key factors that might have caused this issue. So first of all, the forest land, as you all know, most natural forest land in Madagascar belong to the government. So that is there under state ownership, but with very poor enforcement. And this makes it virtually open access. So as a result, identifying forest users and actual beneficiary of compensation could be difficult. Second, stevia or clearing of the clearing of primary forests for agriculture is considered illegal since many years, and no one will then declare themselves as a practitioner of this activity because they fear prosecution. And finally, in a poor country such as Madagascar, lack of up-to-date data on rural people and especially forest dwellers is most of the time a major issue, which impedes identification. And to solve some of these issues, it's really important to clarify land tenure and to know exactly who depends on land affected by the project before a REDD+ project is established. During the identification process, using novel techniques which facilitate the data gathering on illegal activities or potentially sensitive activities might also help. And finally, intensive community mapping and household census, which can be very resource intensive, could provide more reliable and up-to-date information about forest dwellers. So the next question is, how do average published costs on which was based the cost of the compensation measures that were implemented as part of the REDD+ social safeguards compare with our estimates? So if you just look at the annual opportunity cost, we found $233. This seems quite comparable to the annual cost published in the safeguard plan of the protected area following the World Bank standards, 120. However, we found that the median net present value of the opportunity cost across households in all sites was almost like $2,355.75, whereas the official safeguard measures assumed that these costs were just one-off, and that is they were only felt in one single year. However, our study suggests that the local net cost of preventing Sweden agriculture, they are exorbitant, they are much higher, and they happen over the long term, that is, they are felt across generations. And this is, I think, a really important result. So this leads us to the next question. So can we actually afford compensations? The answer to that question is yes, absolutely. So the amount of compensation spent per household, what you can see in blue, is much significantly lower than the carbon value that the REDD+ project in the area is expected to deliver during the first 10 years. So our conservative value for the carbon emissions, which could be avoided over the life of the project, represent almost like 11,000 US dollars per household, which is almost 5 times greater than the total net cost of forest conservation from our study. So this means compensation is affordable. So to sum up, the poorest and those living in the most isolated remote areas are bearing the cost of conservation restrictions. And yet we found that these people were not compensated. And these costs are borne over a really long time period, over 60 years across generations. This means that luckily it's never too late. There is still time to address this. And what's encouraging is that the estimates of the social cost of the carbon avoided are much higher, almost 10 times than the estimates, that the opportunity cost estimates. But so far, funds have been very slow to flow to local communities, and this makes compensation difficult. So that's about it. And now I'm going to present another work in progress under a new another project called Forest for Climate and People. So it's still a work in progress, and it's looking at the role of land tenure in forest landscape restoration. Yeah, I'm rather going to present this quickly because I want to leave enough time for questions at the end. So we know that forest and landscape restoration, also known as FLR, for the remainder of my talk, can contribute to mitigating climate change by storing carbon in their soils as well as in their biomass. Many developing countries have made ambitious commitments to large-scale FLR, including Madagascar. Madagascar especially has committed to restoring 4 million hectares by 2030 under the Bond Challenge. However, global and national analysis of FLR potentially frequently ignore social legal complexities, which will affect both the effectiveness of FLR and in terms of forest, hectares of forest restored, as well as the equitability of the outcomes. And the aim of this study is to understand the extent to which land tenure constraints might affect the design, implementation, and outcomes of FLR. So we are first going to start with a global analysis before diving in a case study focused on Madagascar. So as I said, we started with a global analysis by overlapping maps of reforestation potential as published by influential articles by Strasbourg et al. In Nature with land tenure and world governance indicators. And then we zoomed in Madagascar to do a legal review of policies, laws, regulations, anything related to land issues, as well as forest landscape restoration in Madagascar. This work has been published in Madagascar Conservation and Development, and it's also open access. We also conducted several interviews with many stakeholders from all over Madagascar. So these stakeholders include anyone who might have a stake in in the implementation or in the outcomes of forest restoration projects in Madagascar. So they can be decision makers, government authorities, lawyers, academics, as well as project promoters. And the interviews covered how restoration is conceptualized by these various stakeholders, how land tenure is perceived and considered in the design of the restoration projects, their interpretation of tenure laws, and any tenure, land tenure challenges that they face. We also conducted focus groups and semi-structured interviews with local communities across 9 sites in Madagascar. And the interviews, as well as the focus groups, covered any perceived changes in land tenure from the establishment of the implementation of restoration, any land conflicts caused by the FLR project, and the influence of land tenure on their willingness to participate in the restoration activities. Our global spatial analysis reveals that 42% of the areas identified by Strasbourg et al. As being in the top 20% of restoration potential, that is areas with high restoration potential, are in countries where more than 20% of land is used or held by indigenous and local communities and is not formally acknowledged by the government. We also found, so that's the first figure on the top, sorry, it's a bit small, so I'm not sure how well you can see it. The bottom one shows that almost like 78% of these areas that are also identified as being, as having like high restoration potential are in countries with below median scores of the World Governance Indicators. So these are the rule of law indicators by the World Bank. Yeah, this shows that areas with the highest restoration, so I should say restoration here, sorry, potential are disproportionately found in countries with significant areas of contested land tenure or weak rule of law. And later, I'm going to say a few words about the implications of this on people's livelihoods. So if we zoom in Madagascar, of the 27 million hectares of identified as being high potential for restoration, so that almost represents 47% of Madagascar total land area. 10% overlaps with protected areas and are under unspecified tenure. Outside of protected areas, more than 70% of the areas with high restoration potential are under unrecognized community tenure. And we I want to outline to highlight that this is conservative because land tenure is disproportionately formalized on big lands or in urban areas, and where or in rural areas where agriculture is intensive, like irrigated rice fields, which therefore have low FLR potential, restoration potential. So if we if we present just very briefly the results, the findings from the interviews, stakeholder interviews and focus groups, both with national stakeholders and local communities, we found like 4 general themes. So first of all, you know that in Madagascar, the hope, the expectation is that restoration will mostly be upscale, will take place on lands that have been demarcated by the previously by the Madagascar law. But when these project proponents actually looked for these areas, they had to face the hard truth, the challenging truth that most targeted areas for restoration in Madagascar overlap with customary lands. So these lands are target areas, have been mostly occupied by local people. Second, we found that the motivation and the benefit from forest restoration are affected by land tenure. And in particular, the uncertain benefits from ecological restoration. When I say ecological restoration, I'm specifically referring to the restoration of natural forests that have been previously destroyed. So this most commonly involve native species. They reduce local support. And this is because ecological restoration in Madagascar is usually initiated on land where the government has de jure tenure. So these are state-owned land, and where there is no intention to strengthen private tenure, such as in and around protected areas. And currently, there is no prospect for consumptive uses. So local people question whether they will benefit from these public goods, especially as the property rights over these ecosystem services are often lacking. Third, the perception, there is this widespread perception that security of tenure will be weakened by restoration. So there is a fear, general fear, that the state, the government, or over more powerful entities will claim the newly restored lands later, which means that they will have wasted their efforts and their energy and resources in restoring the lands, because these are native species which theoretically belong to the government. And finally, one slightly encouraging result is that tenure securitization can be a tool for incentivizing forest landscape restoration. And this is often the case with exotic, fast-growing species, because sometimes people, even if they lack the formal land tenure, they do invest in these fast-growing species, and their expectation is that their investments in tree planting will increase the legitimacy of their land claims, despite the lack of formal proofs. So just to conclude this study, just as global conservation priority setting has favored poorer countries for their apparently lower opportunity costs, forest restoration seems to follow the same patterns, and they risk repeating the same mistakes, the previous mistakes of conservation. Besides favoring high biodiversity countries, as well as high poverty areas, they also significantly overlap with areas of high contested land tenure and weak governance. And there is a risk that this might lead to project failure, as well as significant welfare costs, as well as human rights concerns. Proponents of tropical forest landscape restoration must recognize that relatively low opportunity costs of lands do not necessarily indicate low overall costs of conservation once the land tenure and governance risks are taken into account, and adequate funds need to be allocated to these issues. The Madagascar focused case study in particular showed that it will not be possible to upscale forest landscape restoration without resolving land tenure issues. And while I was searching the published literature, I found that this is not unique to Madagascar, and these points have wider applicability. And some of the solutions could include resolving competing land claims, recognizing potential social costs, and ensuring flow of short-term benefits to local communities and their equitable inclusion in decision-making processes, especially when it comes to negotiating their land rights, and the resulting impacts on the distribution of costs and benefits. So just for the last couple of minutes, as you know, we've published many of these studies, we've published articles, but we all know that everyone is too busy these days to read articles. So we wanted a more personal, more human way of communicating these findings. By making a short film that's targeting primarily donors as well as decision makers. And this film was launched last October. We had an expert panel discussion, and the event was chaired by the well-known BBC reporter, Tom Heap. We had also the minister, as well as important figures in nature-based solutions. And the discussion was very good because we didn't shy away from discussing the real and difficult challenges of implementing conservation and restoration in poor countries such as Madagascar. The trailer of the film was shown at the IUCN World Congress in September at the plenary event. And our effort to get the government on board has been also successful. And the film was shown at Madagascar's pre-COP, where politicians were getting ready for COP26 in Glasgow, and where they discussed what Madagascar's position will be on the main issues under discussion. On the eve of COP, we also brought the Minister of Environment, the then Minister of Environment, Pomyavuti, as well as the ambassador, the UK ambassador, to travel to the village at the forest frontier to discuss how local communities feel that global policies around forest could be better implemented to make it more effective and equitable. This moment was so interesting because of the very rich exchange between the community and the decision makers. And the most innovative thing we did on the excursion was the role-playing exercise between decision makers and local people. So in that role-play, we exchange places. So the local community has taken the place of the decision makers. And this exercise was very important because they helped all actors to understand each other's positions and responsibilities. So in all, this exercise revealed that there can be no concrete results without the involvement of all. We were also able to get lots of international coverage for the film. For example, the clips were played in a BBC Radio 4 program called Unheard Voices from COP26. So to sum up, I'd like to really strongly urge you to watch the film. So there is a very short version, trailers, both in English and French. And I've also put the link to the full film, full 10 minutes here, if you are interested to know more. And yeah, last 30 seconds before we open the floor to the questions. So the Forest for Climate and People has recently ended, but we have now a new project called Mitantan Arajarni, or Mirari, which is funded by Darwin, where we are hoping to continue some of this work on implementing more resilient and equitable conservation and restoration. And for the next 5 years, I'll be also focusing on a grant from the African Academy of Sciences, where I'll be looking at the most effective policy levers for scaling up climate-smart agriculture in Africa, specifically in Madagascar, where I'll be using both like a mixed method approach, like surveys, innovative interactive games, as well as a randomized control trial to test the impact of unconditional cash transfers, as well as knowledge transfers on people's willingness to adopt climate smart agriculture in Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you for presenting. Every issue we talk about in any of these conversations always starts with, this is one straightforward issue. And in all of these conversations, it's always like, and it's very much more complicated than you think. So thank you for breaking it down for us, for showing us all those different angles. We haven't seen any questions come in on the YouTube side of things. So if Marie Roland or the students at CURSA have any questions, we will go ahead and send it over to them. Thank you once again for your presentation.
Oh, thanks to you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Sarobidy, for the nice presentation. And as I said before, here from CURSA, we really appreciate all your effort in scientific publications and and research. So we have 3 questions in total. So the first one, did people in Mantadia and Andasibe also receive some benefits from tourism or not?
Yeah. Do you want to say all 3 questions first, or shall I immediately answer?
You can you can answer it directly, because the second question and the first question is not really linked with the first one.
Okay. Yeah. So Mantadi and Zamena, so these are the longer established protected areas. I think they were established back in 1994. So almost like, yeah, a little bit less than 30 years now. So they've received some benefits from tourism revenues. So basically the park, 50% of the park entrance fee should go to the local communities to offset some of these negative impacts. But we all know that practically this is quite difficult because most of these tourism revenues also like help cover some of the management costs of the protected areas. So when I asked about these benefits, people were like, they could hardly see these benefits. So yeah, they are perceived as being very little or almost non-existent. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So our second question is about the compensation, because when I discussed with my students, they asked me that is this free? Is this price of $233? Is it still the same now, or is it increasing? Because they think that it is too low, and they would prefer a kind of compensation like a rice bag per month per household instead of this price. And the third question is about the corruption around the land tenure, because our students say that most of the most factors that affecting the land security is the corruption, and in your papers they did not see it like a major factor, but maybe you cited it in weak governance. Yeah. Okay, so that's
okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Mari. So the second question, is the cost actually increasing? So the study, I must say, the data was collected like in 2014. So that's almost like 8 years ago. And of course, with the rising cost of living, this must have gone up. And the key thing we wanted to do is to come up with some monetary estimates of this cost. So we wanted to be able to say, like, look, in dollars term, this is the median. So that value, that amount, $233 is the median net cost per household per year. But the net total present value is much higher. It's like $2,300 something dollars, so much higher, the total net cost. And as I said, this is just to it's really important to present some monetary figures, but that doesn't necessarily imply that the compensations that will be delivered to communities to offset this cost will need to be also like in dollar in cash. Yeah, these are some of the questions I actually put in my presentation in Malagasy to ask, where I usually ask students, would it be better to deliver that money in cash or in kind? So if it's in kind, what kind of compensation should be appropriate? So this is of course an open question. We don't like present strong views on whether it should be in cash or in kind. That's not the question. The key point was to come up with a monetary figure in dollar terms. And then the third question was about corruption and land tenure. So this is exactly what we wanted to show by overlapping areas that were identified as having a high restoration potential with areas where countries where there is a weak governance indicator, and one of them is weak rule of law, which is significantly correlated with correlation. So the higher the lower rule of law, the lower corruption is, basically. And you are totally right. We found that areas with high corruption are more likely to be identified as areas with high restoration potential, and this can be very problematic because it means that there are significant risks that most of the restoration and conservation initiatives will, on the contrary, make poor people poorer. Yeah, so this is a real issue. And as I said, this is still a work in progress, but in the paper that I'm currently drafting, we do point out, we do highlight these issues and that they need to be looked at. Although these are potentially like sensitive issues. Have I answered your questions, Marie, or is there anything you want me to elaborate on?
Thanks a lot for the answers. I think that they are right and logic and understandable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So I don't see any other questions coming in. So if there are no more questions from the students in Cursa, we can already go ahead and wrap up a few minutes early. But thank you once again for joining us today, everybody who was able to watch. Thank you for presenting. Thank you for asking such great questions. We will be pausing our Malagasy speaker series for a little while, and then we'll catch back up in just a few months. We will be sure and promote our next speakers on all of our channels. So definitely look out for future speakers. And if you missed any of our seminars from the last month and a half or so, please check out the rest of them on our YouTube channel. We've had some really amazing speakers join us this spring and summer months in the United States. So we're really, really excited that we've been able to work with the Duke Africa Initiative, the students over at Cursa, Marie Roland and her team, and all of our amazing speakers. Any other last minute questions coming in?
Yeah, the last question is about the climate smart agriculture systems, because we have vanilla plantations here in SAVA region, and it has been demonstrated that vanilla can stock carbon. So we would like to ask, is there any compensation that can be possible from that?
Yeah, thank you, Marie. That's a really good question. So this is a study, a research project that will be starting soon in July. And we haven't decided on the project site, the study sites. We've considered the SAVA region, of course, as one of the potentially really interesting study sites, but I will still need to look carefully at the budget, because I know like SAVA is so expensive as well. So we'll need to carefully weigh in the value, the benefits of doing it in the SAVA, where vanilla is a really important crop, and also in other areas, hopefully probably in the western part of Madagascar. So it's still under consideration, but I'm hoping to collaborate with James Herrera from DLC and see what's feasible. But if you're going to work in the SAVA, of course, we're gonna select a random sample of farmers, where we'll be like offering some money, some cash, as well as some technical advice, and see how that affects their decisions to invest in, like climate smart agriculture, and how also that affects their willingness to support forest conservation. Thank you.
Oh,
And yeah.
thank you. Yeah, thank you for the answer, and the people here at Cursa, we are happy to collaborate with that project.
Oh, thank you so much. And I loved the SAVA region. I've only been there once, but I loved it. It's just so beautiful. And thanks so much to the Duke Lemur Center, to Bethany and Anne for inviting me. It was a pleasure talking about these issues.
Awesome. If anybody had any questions that come up that didn't get answered today, please feel free to email any of us. You can email the Duke Lemur Center directly, and we can make sure we pass it along. But once again, thank you all for being here.